Okay, so I want to think aloud about this question whether we can understand modernity without invoking capitalism. In other words, in understanding modernity, which concept has a priority? My own intuition, I guess, or contention is that you cannot understand modernity without understanding capitalism and invoking capitalism. In other words, without prioritizing capitalism. In other words, in my understanding, capitalism is the foundation of modern civilization. Its basic creed, its basic religion, its basic way of life, or in Islamic context, we can say it's a deen. So, capitalism is the deen, the way of life. Capitalism is the civilization or non-civilization, and everything else is modernity, humanism, secularism, fascism, socialism, communism, liberalism, are its ideologies, different ideologies. So I'm just, and if you don't invoke capitalism and you prioritize any other concept like modernity or humanism or secularism, you won't be able to understand those concepts as they should be understood in understanding our present reality. So I'm just going to think aloud about these issues in this session and maybe in the following session as well if we need one. Okay, so the first thing to understand is this concept in this context is what is modernity. So modernity is a period in history modernity is a new civilization or beginning of new civilization which replaces the previous civilization in Europe, North Western Europe, and the civilization it replaces is Christian civilization. I don't mean Christian religion, but Christian civilization, Christian way of life, which was an amalgam of Judaic, Hebrew traditions and Roman traditions and Greek traditions and old European pagan traditions and so forth, but that was overall a Christian civilization, a civilization based on the centrality of the concept of God, and everything was subservient to it, at least in theory. So modernity is a civilization. Civilization. By civilization, I mean a way of life in the most comprehensive sense, in the sense in which we use the word deen or deen. But there's no normative. When I call something civilization, doesn't mean that I agree or disagree with it or attribute any. It's just a factual thing. Christian civilization. We have modern civilization, and the basic difference between modern civilization. So modern civilization itself is an amalgam of part of Christian civilization and reinterpretation of it, and reinterpretation of Greek and Roman and pagan civilizations of old Europe. So modern civilization, although it rejects and transplants the core concept of Christian civilization, it builds on it as well. So that's why it's a modern civilization. It's not just simply going back to Greece or Rome or even pagan Europe, because even though modern civilization fundamentally rejects and transcends Christian civilization in crucial aspects, modern civilization and its concept and its reality is not possible without Christian civilization. So there's a dialectical relationship between modern civilization and Christian civilization. In a sense, modern civilization is based on reinterpretation of Christian civilization in such a way that the concept of God, which was central to Christian civilization, is replaced by the concept of man. And that's why, in very key aspects, modern civilization is humanism, in this very sense, that it's a civilization which is based on the centrality and sovereignty of man. And centrality, and it replaces the centrality and sovereignty of God. But this centrality of man would not have been possible merely on the basis of Greece or Rome. we needed Christian civilization for this conception of the sovereignty and centrality of man to emerge, because Christianity, despite the fact that it was a civilization based on the centrality of God, it gave us the idea of man God. The idea of man God. The idea that man can become God. And for Christianity, that was just one man. And the modern reinterpretation of Christianity says that it is every man. So that's the link and the transformation. Now, this centrality of man is the basis of modern civilization. But this centrality can itself be understood in three ways, at least three ways. Man as an individual, so each individual is the man replaces God. In that sense, man is the new God. And when Nietzsche said God is dead, that's what he meant. It's replaced by man. And obviously postmodernists like Foucault would afterwards claim that man is dead. Because they, according to them, the civilization based on centrality of man was being replaced by some other civilization. So this is individualism. So man as individual. So this would be championed by different versions of liberalism, for example. The second sense in which man can be understood as not an individual but a species. So not every individual is God, but the species as a whole is God. So this would be sovereignty not of man as such, but humanity. And this version is represented by different communitarian strains of thought, like socialism, communism, communalism, etc. And the third one is man understood as different groups of man. So nationalism, for example. So man in the form of a nation, or the representative of a nation, for example, Superman or Führer. So this third version is represented by different sorts of nationalism, racism, Nazism, fascism. In that sense, fascism, socialism, liberalism, they're all part and parcel of modernity. So this is the civilization which replaced. Obviously, it took hundreds, if not thousands of years, hundreds of years, for modernity to replace Christianity, and then became a dominant civilization. And dating is not that important, but it's started replacing Christian civilization, 15th, 16th century, and today we can say that it is the dominant civilization in Europe and America and Japan, and it's becoming dominant in other parts of the world as well. We are living this modernity, even though some people have claimed that it has already passed, and is being replaced by another civilization, post-modernity. But post-modernity is, even if there is a new civilization called post-modernity, modernity itself is part and parcel of it, as the name shows. And post-modernity can rather be seen as a disintegration of modernity or earlier versions of it rather than a new civilization. Okay, so here capitalism comes. What's the relationship between capitalism and this modernity? And why capitalism is central to understanding all these versions of modernity. Now, capitalism. What's the relationship between this sovereignty of man in all three senses with capitalism? And once we understand this relationship, we be able to understand why capitalism is the foundation of modern civilization. And all other versions of different ideologies of this civilization. In order to understand this relationship, we need to ask ourselves, what does the sovereignty of man in all three senses implies and requires? Sovereignty of man invokes two concepts: freedom and reason. Man as a species or as an individual has desire for freedom or potential for freedom, and that freedom is based on its power of reason. And freedom itself can be understood as lack of limitations from outside and resources to implement its will in the positive sense. So sovereignty of man in all three senses requires that human will is sovereign. And sovereignty of human will means that it is free in these two senses. First, that it doesn't have any limitations from outside. So freedom in the negative sense. And these outside limitations are both factual as well as normative. But this is not enough, because you also need that you can will what you will and you implement your will in positive sense. For that you need resources as well. And I guess you also need resources so that your will is not limited from outside. Because Christian God has this sovereignty of will, because nothing inhibits its authority from outside. So it's negatively absolute, this will, and also positively it can do whatever it wants. So that is free in negative sense, and free, this will is free in negative sense and free in positive sense. And modernity in a sense is a movement to free man from this self-incurred tutelage. Free it from external authorities, external constraints, be they natural constraints or normative constraint, and then make humans resourceful so they can implement their wills positively in all three senses, so depending individually or species or group wise. So what is the limitations on this will? Limitations are scarcity, like external constraints, and positively it's scarcity. And modernity is in a sense project which announces the potential for humanity to become God, but says that we cannot do that unless we overcome scarcity of resources, and we can overcome this scarcity of resources through employing our reason. Reason become important. So reason is important for freedom of will in both senses, because reason teaches us how to get out of subjugation to gods and nature, and also reason tells us how to overcome scarcity in order for our will to will whatever we will. So in that sense, reason is closely related to freedom. And in that sense, sovereignty of man was also sovereignty of reason. Because without sovereignty of reason, you can't have sovereignty of man. And this reason was assumed to be the divine element in human beings, which make them worthy of being God or in one of those three senses. It is here that capitalism comes first, in conceptually speaking, because capitalism is the idea that in order to overcome scarcity, you need to dedicate yourself to accumulation for the sake of accumulation. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation, and that's what capitalism is. And that's what capital is. Capital is anything whose sole purpose is to multiply itself. And capitalism teaches us that in order to overcome scarcity, you need to dedicate yourself to accumulation for the sake of accumulation. But in order to do that, you need to make two desires sovereign. One is acquisitiveness and the other is covetousness. And the second is covetousness. In the technical terms, you call acquisitiveness accumulation, or the search for accumulation for the sake of accumulation. Covetousness is competition. So in order to accumulate, in order to overcome scarcity, you need to build a civilization which is dedicated to these two things: sovereignty of accumulation and sovereignty of covetousness. And there's no accident that these two desires were sins in the previous civilization, that is the Christian civilization. So in order to actually establish the sovereignty of man, you actually need to establish the sovereignty of desire. And sovereignty of desire means that you build an individuality which is dominated by these desires. You build a society or social system, social norms and institutions which are built on this desire, and you build a stage which is dedicated to these two desires. And that's why capitalism, in that sense, not an economic system but a system of individualization, a system of socialization, in a system of uh, statehood power. So in order to establish the sovereignty of man, what you need practically is to establish the sovereignty of desire, especially two desires: the desire to accumulate and desire to compete. And although man has attempted to become the Lord, in order to do that, what has happened is man has actually become the servant of desires, especially two desires. And that's not accident, because desires have this strange quality that if you limit them, they are under your control, but if you give them free rein, they become sovereign and rule over you rather than you ruling them. And that's how the civilization we are living in. This also comes out through the analysis of freedom and reason as well. And human will as well. And we find that freedom and will and reason cut off from transcendent anchors, they are no more than desires in different forms. So in this sense, humanism's practical project leads to capitalism, and the civilization built on sovereignty of and worship of man practically become a civilization which worships desires, and in which desires are sovereign. And that's the thing, whenever man worship himself in any form, is basically end up worshipping desires, anonymous desires which are lord over man rather than the other way around. That's why it's important to make capitalism as a civilization. The foundation of our understanding of modernity and all other ideologies. And if we don't do that, then we will miss the essence of modern civilization, I think. So that was just an outline of my argument. And in coming session, hopefully we'll pick up certain issues within this outline, discuss them a bit more, or discuss them at length. Thank you.